Imagine walking through the marble streets of ancient Rome, sunlight reflecting off polished columns, laughter echoing from bathhouses, and the hum of a city that claimed to be the center of the civilized world, and yet behind those walls, in kitchens, vineyards, mines, and palaces, lived millions of men and women who were not citizens, not foreigners, not even legally considered human, but property, catalogued in law as race, a Latin word meaning thing, the same word used for a chair, a jug, or a goat. And here is the terrifying paradox. While Rome glorified freedom as the pinnacle of human achievement, it built that freedom on the unfreedom of others. And the question we ask tonight is chilling, not in what owners could do, but in what they couldn't. Because when the law treats you as an object, what limits truly exist, what lines could not be crossed, and more disturbingly, why those lines were drawn at all. Were they out of morality or merely out of self-interest, efficiency, and fear of rebellion? For history rarely reveals compassion without motive, and Rome was no different. So as we unravel this story together, keep in mind that we are not only studying a legal system of the past, we are peering into the anatomy of unchecked power, where control extended into every corner of life and the so-called boundaries of ownership. Tell us more about the fragility of empire than about mercy. Because if slaves were essential, then laws limiting cruelty were less about kindness and more about preserving Rome itself. And in that contradiction lies the essence of tonight's journey, what Roman slave owners, even in all their arrogance, were told they could not do, though whether those rules mattered is another question entirely. To understand the boundaries of Roman slavery, we must first examine the brutal baseline. Because for centuries in the Republic, a master's power was absolute. What the Romans called vita nescisque potestas, the power of life and death, and at its core this meant an owner could strike, brand, starve, sell, or even kill a slave without needing to justify the act. Imagine that sure fate hanging on whether your master woke up in a good mood, or whether the stew you served was too salty. And here is the disturbing truth. When you start with total control, the story of limits is not one of compassion, but of gradual restriction. A tightening leash placed not on cruelty itself, but on its visibility and efficiency, because even Rome realized that killing valuable labor was economically foolish and socially dangerous. The first reforms therefore appeared not out of pity, but out of pragmatism. Emperor Hadrian, often remembered for his wall stretching across Britain, also erected invisible walls within Roman households, decreeing that a master could not casually execute a slave without cause. But here is where the hypocrisy shines. Cause was so broad it could mean almost anything: insolence, disobedience, or simply being inconvenient. Yet the very existence of such a rule marked a shift. The state was saying, your slave is your property, yes, but your property is also our workforce, our tax base, our soldiers' attendance. So treat them with at least a shred of restraint. Later, emperors like Antoninus Pius refined this, hinting that killing a slave without state approval could be treated as murder. And while enforcement was inconsistent, the message was clear. Master's authority had limits. Not because Rome discovered empathy, but because Rome feared two things above all: wasted wealth and slave uprisings. After all, Spartacus and his army had burned a lesson into their memory, that brutality without control invites rebellion. So the legal boundaries were less about protecting slaves than about protecting Rome from itself. But the law of life and death was not the only battlefield of control. There was another realm where Rome's so-called boundaries evaporated entirely: the private and personal space of the enslaved body, because while a decree might say you needed permission to execute, no law ever told you not to touch, to take, or to violate, and this silence speaks volumes, for in a system where a slave was an object, consent did not exist, and so intimate exploitation was normalized, expected, and rarely spoken of. It was as routine as pouring wine or scrubbing marble floors. And here is the part that chills us today. Roman authors did not need to spell out that owners could demand sexual access because it was so taken for granted. Like the assumption that you could wear your own shoes or eat from your own plate. And while modern readers may ask, were there protections? The answer is cruelly technical. If someone else harmed your slave, you could sue not because of the human dignity violated, but because of damage to property value. A body treated as if it was scratched silver or a chipped vase, and later Christian emperors issued vague codes about modesty and morality. Fig leaf reforms meant more to polish Rome's image than to protect the enslaved. For nothing changed in the lived experience. The imbalance of power remained absolute. And here is where we must reflect, because when society normalizes that, the most private parts of a human life are subject to command. Resistance itself becomes punishable, silence becomes survival, and the absence of law reveals more than law ever could. It reveals a world where the boundaries of ownership bled into the deepest corners of identity and intimacy, unchecked and unrecorded. And to study this is to confront not only what Rome allowed, but what it erased. Voices and stories lost in the margins of history. Now, if personal boundaries were non-existent, what about family? That most basic human anchor, the place where love and kinship give people strength. In Rome, this too was reshaped by ownership, because slaves could not marry in the eyes of the law. Marriage, or connubium, was a privilege of free citizens. A civic institution meant to pass property and status from one generation to another, but when it came to slaves, those bonds were invisible. Instead, they had what Romans called contubernium, a word that literally meant sharing a tent, which sounds more like a military arrangement than a love story, and that is exactly how Rome treated it. Not as sacred, but as tolerated convenience. Masters could permit such unions and even encourage them when it meant children would be born into slavery, a self-replicating labor force that required no purchase at the market. Yet here is the cruelty. Those same bonds could be torn apart at a whim. One partner sold to a farm in Sicily, the other kept in Gaul to polish mosaics. Children scattered or taken away, and no matter how many years a couple shared, the law recognized none of it, yet history records countless examples of enslaved men and women building families anyway, grasping at dignity and stability where none was guaranteed. And in rare cases, when freedom came later, their unions could be retroactively acknowledged. A bitter consolation, like being handed a marriage certificate after decades of separation. The point is this: the inability to marry was not only a legal restriction, it was a deliberate denial of humanity, because to deny a person the right to form a recognized family is to deny them permanence. And it reminds us that for Rome, control was not satisfied with labor, it extended to identity, love, and legacy, ensuring that even affection itself was filtered through ownership. If Rome could strip away family bonds, it could just as easily strip away names, and with names went identity. Because in Roman households, a slave's individuality was malleable clay in the hands of their master. Names could be given, erased, mocked, or replaced on a whim. You could be born with a Greek name like Callista, most beautiful, and end up a spatula because a Roman lady thought it amusing, and once that stuck, it followed you everywhere. Not as a mark of who you were, but as a reminder of who owned you. This was not random cruelty. It was a system designed to erase lineage and heritage, to cut the thread of memory so thoroughly that even when freed, slaves carried the family name of their master, forever tethered to the person who had once commanded them. And satire from Roman authors reveals the absurdity. Households where every servant was called by the same name, Davis, so that when the master shouted, 5 men would appear, and 4 would be punished just in case. It seems comic until you realize it reflects a chilling truth. Names were not for the enslaved. They were for the convenience of the owner, a way to mark function, not identity. Cook was Cocuse. Steward was dispensator, and if you failed, you might be renamed idiot. A cruel branding as sharp as any iron. And here lies the tragedy. Even when slaves rose to roles of trust, educating noble children or managing estates, one mistake could erase their earned respect and reduce them back to a number or a joke. So what couldn't Roman owners do? They could not allow slaves to carry a stable, permanent self, because permanence meant history, and history meant recognition, and in Rome recognition was the privilege of the free, while the enslaved were meant to be both everywhere and invisible. And yet, even as Rome treated slaves like nameless objects, it demanded from many of them the brilliance of scholars. Because while some were condemned to mines and fields, others were educated to astonishing levels, especially Greek captives, who became the tutors, doctors, and philosophers of Roman households. This is the paradox that gnaws at the heart of the empire. You were legally a thing, but expected to perform as a walking encyclopedia, to recite Homer, diagnose fevers, manage accounts, or compose speeches for senators who could barely spell their own names. And the Romans adored this arrangement because it allowed them to bask in the glow of Greek learning without investing in their own education. So the master appeared cultured while the slave carried the weight of knowledge. But do not mistake this for generosity. It was a calculation. An educated slave was more valuable, could be rented out, displayed as a status symbol, or used as a profitable business tool. Knowledge became property just as much as muscle. And yet, imagine the psychological strain of being wiser than your master, of teaching his son philosophy by day and scrubbing his sandals by night. It created a world where intellect did not free you but chained you tighter. Because the better you were, the less likely you were to be discarded. Rome was built on this contradiction. That brilliance could be enslaved and obedience demanded even from genius. And when we recall figures like Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who began life as a slave, we see how resilience and wisdom were forged not in classrooms, but under the weight of chains. So what couldn't Roman owners do? They couldn't stop slaves from thinking, from learning, from shaping ideas that outlasted the empire itself. But they could and did claim ownership over every product of that mind, as though knowledge itself could be branded with iron. But even in this world of suffocating control, there existed thin, fragile cracks in the wall of ownership. Legal channels so narrow and perilous, they almost mocked the very idea of justice. Because in theory, a slave could complain about a master's cruelty, yet the process resembled less a protection of rights and more a gamble against fate. One path was called jus supplicandi, the right to throw yourself at the feet of the emperor's statue and beg for intervention, a desperate move that required both courage and spectacle. Because how often would an emperor, buried in petitions from governors and generals, take notice of a trembling slave in chains? Another route involved appealing to local magistrates, especially if you were hired out and mistreated by someone other than your master. But again, the motivation behind these rare protections was not compassion. It was public orderum was obsessed with appearances, and when cruelty became too obvious, when a body left in the street offended the dignity of the city, then the state might step in, not for the victim's sake, but to preserve the illusion of harmony. And here lies the irony. Laws against excessive beatings or wanton torture were written. But excessive had no clear meaning. Was a limp excessive, or only death? Was a scar an outrage, or merely a cost of labor? The vagueness left slaves at the mercy of interpretation. An interpretation was always stacked in favor of the free. So while technically an enslaved person could petition, practically the risk was enormous. Retaliation could follow. Freedom was unlikely, and silence was often safer. It reminds us that Rome's limits were paper-thin, a theater of legality built to satisfy the conscience of rulers more than the suffering of the enslaved. And that gap between theory and practice is perhaps the clearest definition of injustice. Yet for all the suffocating control, Rome maintained one glimmering loophole, a narrow path toward freedom that even the most ruthless master could not completely close, and that was manumission, the act of granting liberty to a slave. And here is where Roman pragmatism reveals itself most clearly. Because while cruelty could be endless, the idea of eventual release was baked into the system, not as a human right, but as a tool of management. Hope itself became a form of control. By dangling the possibility of freedom after decades of loyalty and obedience, masters could keep entire households disciplined. For who would risk rebellion if patience might one day buy a new life? Manumission could happen in many ways: through formal ceremonies before magistrates, through a clause in a master's will, or through special service that earned favor. But even here Rome imposed quotas. You could not free too many at once, lest the balance of free and enslaved shift too quickly. A master with 3 slaves could only free to a legal rationing of liberty as though it were bread. And if the master was in debt or legally incompetent, his slaves remained shackled, tied not just to his whims but to his financial mismanagement. Yet once freed, former slaves did not become equal citizens. They were freedmen, with rights to own property and businesses, but barred from high office, forever marked by their origin. And the greatest irony, many freedmen went on to own slaves themselves, replicating the very system that once imprisoned them. A cycle that reveals how deeply Rome normalized bondage as part of its economy and culture. So what could masters do? They could not strip away the possibility of manumission once it was legally opened, but they could delay it, manipulate it, and use it as leverage. And in that tension lay both the cruelty and the cunning of Roman law, a recognition that even hope could be weaponized. If freedom dangled like a distant prize, marriage across the boundary of freedom remained an even thornier matter. For Roman law drew a hard line when it came to the civic institution of matrimony. A master could command his slave's body, his labor, even his love, but he could not legally marry him or her unless manumission came first. This prohibition was less about morality and more about preserving the sanctity of Roman citizenship. Marriage, or connubium, was not about romance, but about bloodlines, inheritance, and political alliances. And to admit slaves into that circle would have been to blur the very hierarchies on which Rome was built. Yet human lives rarely fit neatly into legal codes, and so masters frequently entered into contubernium with their slaves, unofficial unions, where a slave might live with the master as a de facto spouse, bear his children, and run his household in every sense but legality. The tragedy was that the children of such unions, if born to an enslaved mother, were slaves themselves, perpetuating bondage in the very moment love tried to create family. And while some masters eventually freed these partners to marry them formally, the social stigma remained: whispers at banquets, disapproval in the Senate, reminders that Rome feared contamination of status more than it feared cruelty. And here is the striking irony: masters could violate the most private parts of a slave's existence without question, but tying a public knot, legitimizing that bond before society, was forbidden. Not because Rome protected the enslaved, but because Rome protected its rigid definition of honor. So what owners couldn't do was to elevate their private relationships into the public realm of marriage without first rewriting the status of the person they claimed to love. And this tells us that for Rome, law was not about people but about appearances, not about affection but about order. If Rome forbade marriage as a way of guarding its civic honor, it drew an even sharper line around political power, for slaves, no matter how brilliant or trusted, could never step into public office, not even in the smallest capacity, because politics in Rome was bound to the concept of libertas, the dignity of being freeborn. And to imagine a former property holder sitting in the Senate was to tear at the very fabric of Roman hierarchy. This exclusion persisted even for freedmen who had clawed their way to partial citizenship. They could own land, run businesses, and accumulate wealth, but they were barred from the highest magistracies, a reminder that money might buy comfort, but it did not buy pedigree. And here lies the hypocrisy. Again, many of the speeches recited in the Senate were drafted by slaves. Many of the estates run by senators were managed by enslaved accountants. The empire's infrastructure depended on the intellect and labor of those legally invisible. Yet the spotlight of office was kept exclusively for the freeborn elite. Rome feared the symbolism of an enslaved past elevated to authority. It was one thing to use their words, quite another to let their voices be heard directly, and this fear bled into the courtroom as well, where slaves could not testify under oath unless tortured, the assumption being that their loyalty to masters would compel them to lie, and so the law declared pain a better truth serum than dignity. A legal paradox where a system obsessed with order chose brutality as its method of extracting honesty. So what couldn't owners do? They couldn't turn their slaves into senators or judges. They couldn't elevate them into the symbolic machinery of the state. But they could make them the hidden machinery beneath it, carrying the weight while being denied the title, the mind trusted in private, the voice silenced in public, and that silence itself was part of Rome's design, ensuring the empire's stage was filled with noble actors while its script was written by the unseen. For all the ways Rome stripped slaves of autonomy, it did leave one peculiar loophole that reveals just how contradictory the system was. And that was the peculium, a kind of savings account or allowance that technically still belonged to the master, but in practice was treated as the slave's personal fund. Imagine the paradox of being legally classified as property yet permitted to accumulate property of your own, often from tips, side earnings, or profits earned while managing a shop or estate. Some slaves even ran businesses for their masters, keeping a portion aside in their peculium. And here lies the astonishing twist: they could use this fund to buy their own freedom, paying their master for the privilege of no longer being owned. It is one of history's cruel ironies. Working endless hours to gather money, only to hand it back to the very person who profited from your labor in the first place. A system where liberation was treated like a transaction at the marketplace. Yet this paradox was tolerated because it benefited both sides. Masters gained revenue, slaves gained hope, and Roman society gained the appearance of mercy. But there were unwritten rules. A master who seized his slave's peculium without cause was branded dishonorable, cheap in the eyes of his peers, for even among Rome's elite cruelty had to be cloaked in respectability. And this is telling. It shows that Rome's limits on slave owners were often less about law than about reputation. That thin shield of dignitas that could be lost with a single act of pettiness. So what owners couldn't do. They couldn't strip away the concept of peculium without risking their honor, though they still controlled its use. And in this fragile balance we glimpse how survival strategies emerged. Slaves playing the long game, stacking coins quietly, hoping one day to tip the scale from bondage to freedom. A dream that rested not on law but on the patience of waiting and the discipline of saving under watchful eyes. Even in a world where ownership seemed limitless, religion carved out a narrow space that masters could not fully deny. Because in Rome, piety was not just personal belief, it was civic duty, the glue that bound households and the empire itself. Every family honored the lares, the household gods believed, to guard the hearth and the family line. And slaves were part of that ritual, lighting incense, pouring libations, whispering prayers, and in this small act their presence could not be erased. A master might forbid many things, but excluding slaves from religious observances risked more than disobedience. It risked angering the gods, and in Rome that was a line even the most arrogant hesitated to cross. For religion was not about private conscience, but public order, and the sight of slaves participating in rituals reassured neighbors that the household was stable, harmonious, and under divine protection. Some slaves even had their own shrines, their own lares, servals, humble symbols that allowed them to hold onto fragments of identity within captivity. And though these rituals did not undo chains, they offered continuity, a sense that even when Rome stripped away names, marriages, or families, the act of prayer could not be completely stolen. It was one of the few places where ownership paused, not out of kindness but out of fear of cosmic backlash, because even emperors, with all their marble monuments, did not want to be seen as impious. So what couldn't owners do? They couldn't fully erase a slave's participation in the sacred, because in Rome, divine order mattered more than personal dominance. And for the enslaved, this meant that faith, however small, became both a survival tool and a quiet defiance, a whispered reminder that power on earth was not the only power in play. And so we arrive at the final, often overlooked boundary of Roman slavery, not written in marble tablets or carved into legal codes, but etched into the fragile currency of reputation. For in Rome, dignitas one's public honor mattered as much as wealth or bloodline, and this meant that even the most powerful masters had to calculate how their treatment of slaves might be perceived. Excessive cruelty, collective punishments, or scandals of abuse could spark backlash in the Senate, in the forum, even in the gossip of dinner parties. And for a culture obsessed with appearances, this social censure had real weight. Some laws emerged in response to public outrage, not because the state discovered morality, but because the spectacle of unchecked violence threatened stability. Masters began to stage acts of mercy, freeing a slave in public, granting peculium, permitting unions, gestures designed less to improve lives and more to polish image. And here is the bitter truth: limits on slave owners often came not from compassion or law, but from vanity, the fear of being labeled cruel in a world where cruelty was otherwise normal. And this paradox lingers as Rome's final lesson, that power unchecked still collides with reputation, that even emperors' learned appearances could not be ignored. So what owners could not do, ultimately, was behave without consequence, For every act, whether tolerated or punished, fed into Rome's story of itself, a story that valued order above justice and spectacle above mercy. And in studying these limits, we see slavery not as an aberration of Roman greatness, but as its foundation, proof that empires can build monuments while burying humanity. And perhaps the most haunting lesson is that boundaries imposed for appearances are not true protections. They are fragile performances, and the enslaved lived within that theater every day, surviving not because the law defended them, but because endurance itself became resistance, and hope, however faint, became a weapon the empire could never fully confiscate.